The area of corporate development are often wrongfully what folks think of as only being about mergers and acquisitions is something that I feel most PMs aren't involved enough in. This is to the detriment of themselves and also to the detriment of the firms that they work for. Now, I know that this is not a topic that comes up a lot in product management circles, which is deliberately why I decided to give a presentation about it. I think it's an important area that PMs, particularly as you become more senior in your career, need to care about. So first of all, hi, I'm Julian Dunn. I'm currently Senior Director of Product Management for GitHub Actions, which is a continuous integration, continuous delivery software product. And if you don't know what that means, that's okay. Basically, just think about it as the key component of the tools that developers use to ship their code to a production environment. And I'm not going to cover the product at all. I've been at this company called GitHub for about a year. And prior to that, I worked at a company called PagerDuty for 3 years doing product marketing. Before that, I was at a company called Chef that made server automation tools for developers and systems engineers. So in short, I've been doing B2B enterprise software for much of my career. I've worked at a variety of startups and medium to large size companies. But GitHub is the largest company that I've ever worked at, with approximately $1 billion in annual recurring revenue, 3,000 employees. Now, interestingly enough, GitHub itself was the target of a successful acquisition by Microsoft in 2018, but I wasn't working at the company at the time. So my biases are, I've never worked for a pre-Series A startup or a multi-billion dollar company, nor have I worked in B2C or in non-tech B2B tech companies. So the lessons learned here that I describe might be less applicable to you if you're in those scenarios. So my experience with corporate development, or alliances and acquisitions, as I might call it. I'm fortunate to have been directly involved in 2 acquisitions during my product management career. And of course, countless partnerships, IP licensing arrangements, joint sales and revenue sharing arrangements, and so on and so forth. The first of these is while I was at Chef, where I led the acquisition of a small German startup called Volcanosec, founded by these 2 guys you see here, Chris and Dominic. And then while I was working in product marketing at PagerDuty, I was consulted on and involved in the acquisition of Rundeck, which was an IT automation product company. Now, I've also been involved in a lot of alliances and acquisitions that didn't successfully happen. And while I can't talk about those specifics, I have consulted on those things. And what I would say is that I consider the fact that many don't happen to be a success, actually, because in my opinion, just like being a venture capitalist, you should actually be rejecting more opportunities that come across your desk in this area than going forward with them. And that is particularly true when you get to acquisitions. This author named Nuno Fernandes, who's a professor at the IESE Business School, wrote a book called Value Killers. And he and many others have research showing that most mergers fail, and they destroy shareholder value and cost companies billions of dollars. To quote him directly, multiple studies have shown that most mergers and acquisitions fail to generate the anticipated synergies, and many actually destroy value instead of creating it. So, when I first went to journalism school, took some of my first classes in journalism, the first 2 things that my professors told me is if you're about to tell somebody a story or you're going to invest in trying to find out more about that story or that topic, the 2 major things you have to think about are who cares and why now. So, who cares is you, hopefully, as a product manager, and why. So as I said in my opening, to the detriment, PMs are often not properly consulted on corporate development, or even involved in this continuous scouting process. Now there's 2 main reasons for this, I think. One is that, frankly, your product strategy sucks or is non-existent. So if you don't know where you're going, you don't know what resources you need in order to satisfy that product strategy, and what you might need to build, borrow, or buy. So if this is the case, and you're not involved in corporate development, this is squarely on you because your strategy isn't very good or even isn't developed. Number 2 reason for product management not being involved in this area is that often corporate development folks, who often are largely quantitative analysts or that type of individual and report to a CFO, often look at M&A type of activities purely through the lens of finance, and they ignore other factors. They're often out, quote unquote, shopping for targets, thinking it's purely a numbers game. If I add my cash flow to their cash flow, then we get X result. And unfortunately, they involve other functions too late. So if this is the case, this is squarely on the CFO and CEO. They're not involving you. Now, what are the downstream effects if you're not involved? As product, if you don't have a seat at the table, the worst thing that can happen to you is that your leadership team decides to buy something and then makes you, product manager, product leader, whatever, integrate it into your existing technology stack, blowing up whatever strategy, roadmap, and things like that that you already had planned. So that's one reason you care about this. The second reason you should care about this is that in some cases, you building something is actually not the best option to achieve the objectives in your roadmap. There are other ways, perhaps other people have expertise, other people have already done this before, it's more innovative, etc. There's maybe ways that you can get your product strategy achieved without actually needing to build it all yourself. Which gets me into why now? Why now? It's spring of 2023. The economy isn't very good, right? As soon as the economy is not very good, the leadership team means that you're either going to be looking to acquire resources in ways other than organically growing headcount. So your company might be a buyer, or maybe less importantly, and I won't cover this in this talk, your company may actually be an acquisition target, particularly if you work for a small organization. So if you are working at a startup and things like this, it might behoove you to think about how your leadership team is thinking of getting to an exit, possibly by selling your company, and you should be literate and educated enough to be able to talk to them about those particular options and not to just leave it to the CFO. So most of what I cover in this talk is from the perspective of the buy side, but any observations that I have to make about past acquisitions and the technology, cultural, leadership compatibility dimensions of those acquisitions are all applicable if you're on the sell side too. So what is corporate development anyway? Corporate development is often seen as synonymous with M&A, mergers and acquisitions. But M&A is just one corporate development tactic. Corporate development is essentially the business of growing one's business inorganically. Instead of building things, you grow it through alliances, acquisitions, partnerships, etc. Corporate development is fundamentally about satisfying resource requirements for strategic moves that you already know that you want to make. And that is why you need to have a solid product strategy that your leadership team buys into. Otherwise, your corporate development folks or your business development folks who are largely concerned with partnerships specifically, they're just randomly shooting fish in a barrel. And sometimes I've even seen them go out and randomly buy things. So if you're familiar with this book of this title called Playing to Win, How Product Strategy Actually Works, it illustrates a framework for what strategy looks like. And I'm not going to spend too much time talking about how to structure it. It's a fantastic book. It's written by A.G. Lafley, who is the former CEO of Procter & Gamble through the late 90s to the early 2000s, partnered with Roger Martin, who's the dean of the Rotman Business School in Toronto. And they co-wrote it. It's one of the go-to resources that I use when talking to my product managers about how to think strategically and how to structure strategy. As I said, product strategy is a much lengthier topic. I'm not here to discuss that. One thing that product strategy is not is complicated. If your product strategy is complicated, you're probably down the wrong path, and you need to go back to the drawing board. Because product strategy is essentially a point of view or a thesis about the way that the world works or should work, and a set of choices that you make as a product leader to realize that point of view. So, resource acquisition might be some way that you realize that point of view. And a couple of places where you might consider applying corporate development fall into a few areas on this chart that represent strategy. One is, where are we going to play? Perhaps it's faster to partner with or to buy a firm that's already doing what you're doing, but in a different vertical, or a different geographic area, they have local connections, or whatever it is. Another area you might think of applying corporate development is in the how we win box. That you need to somehow expand your value proposition, and you don't have the capabilities to do that today. And the third place you might think of applying corporate development is in the capabilities required box. So you know you are missing some capabilities to make good on your current value proposition, and you don't have them. And for whatever reason, it's better or more expedient or whatever to get them from elsewhere rather than building them yourself. So to summarize, number one, you need to know what your strategy is and what your resource requirements are before being able to have a fruitful build versus borrow versus buy conversation. Number two, corporate development is primarily about satisfying two ways of expanding your value proposition. Either it's a breadth expansion of your value proposition, or it's a depth expansion of your value proposition, or intensification of it. When you start thinking about frameworks and approaches to corporate development, I like to go to this one, which is called the Resource Pathways Framework. It's from a book called Build, Borrow, Buy by Lawrence Capron and Will Mitchell. I find this framework very helpful in evaluating the different possibilities for strategic resource acquisition. Now, we're all product people often, and companies too, that have made their fortunes or been successful in building things. Companies often fall into what the authors call the quote-unquote implementation trap, which is companies working doggedly to perfect the wrong course of action, particularly if it worked for them before. As I said, this course of action is often built for us because that's usually what created that success in the first time. So naturally, organizations and you as product managers have a bias towards this option. You should recognize that. Now, larger companies with more silos, more departments, you actually have a kind of a bigger problem, which is that each silo prefers the choice that worked for them or that they're incentivized by. So while you in product or your peers in engineering are biased towards build, a business development organization is going to be biased towards borrow because all they do is work in partnerships all day long. And a corporate strategy or corporate development team is going to be biased towards a buy option. So let me just walk through this flowchart, evaluation flowchart if you want, super quickly. So starting at the top, if your internal resources are very relevant to either the expansion or intensification of your value proposition, then you're strongly considering building. But if for some strategic reason, or if for some strategic reason you want to develop that expertise in-house that you don't have. So a classic example that's timely is ML or data science skill. You may not have that today, you may not have any data scientists or people doing models and things like that because of what's going on in the industry with ChatGPT and OpenAI and things like that. For some reason, you feel that you need to develop that technology and that expertise, and you go and hire a bunch of engineers to go and do that. Next, if the resources that you seek are easily tradable, in other words, you can write a contract to get them, or you can OEM them, or whatever, white label them, in other words, then borrowing those items via licensing a contract might be a good idea. If they're a little bit less tangible, if you can't write a contract to describe them, so for example, they're people or something, right? You can't really, I guess you can contract humans, you can contract software developers or whatever, but if you need deep expertise and you actually can't just outsource that and contract people to do that, then perhaps that licensing and contract and borrowing is not a good option. Next, if there's a reason for you to have some kind of ongoing close relationship with a partner, so for example, you could do some co-development with some partner to take on a larger joint rival, or you could bundle your products together in some kind of a co-sell arrangement and share revenue, etc., then a deep partnership or an alliance is a good option. And finally, if there are truly articulable and measurable synergies by combining two business entities, and there has to be a true integration plan that's executed, then buy could be a good choice. And I want to emphasize this integration plan thing, because to quote from the book directly, without the creation of new resources when you actually go and do an acquisition, you will almost always overpay for a target. The target firm merely continues to operate as it did before the acquisition, then your purchase of its shares was little more than a passive investment in the stock market. This comes up in my examples below. All right, so with all that said, and that theory, let's get to real brass tacks and doing this for real. So reflecting upon my experience in doing past corporate development, from anywhere from alliances through to acquisition, what I want to cover is how did these things come about? Why was the acquisition ultimately chosen as the method of resource acquisition? Maybe some lessons learned. What went right? What could have gone better? Now, I know all this, when you look at it in the rearview mirror, makes it sound like everything was clean and neat, and that we all sat down, used these strategic frameworks and so on at the time, ran water through them, and then decided on a course of action. No, that never happens. If I knew then, obviously, what I know now about evaluating these kinds of opportunities, we could have avoided a lot of the mistakes that we did make. But in the end, I'd like to think that both of these turned out pretty well, partly due to the diligence that was conducted, and partly just due to sheer luck, frankly. Okay, first example, Chef bought Volcanosec, 2015. How did this come about? Volcanosec was already a partner. They were already using Chef's technology under the hood to apply to compliance and security use cases. And we didn't have a play in compliance and security. Although we did have some market positioning that signaled to the market that we wanted to get into this. Chris and Dominic, who I showed you before, were founders of this company who had actually started as customers using Chef at Deutsche Telekom to try to satisfy compliance and security scenarios. And then from there, they spun up their own company. So initially, I was engaged with them because even though they had their own company, they had a lot of feature requests for me as a product person. But the core product of Chef wasn't really meant to satisfy those use cases, but we kept talking and things like that. The overall outcomes of buying the company were that it was ultimately very positive for the integrated entity. We made good on that position that we already had. We were using a tagline called something like compliance at velocity at the time, but we didn't have a lot of product to back it up. And this got us the product that backed it up. And the reason that I know that this was had a great result for the integrated entity was because within 2 years of buying Volcanosec and having integrated the product into the company, 50% of the reason to buy from customers was because of the compliance features that we now had in the product. And the other thing that it did for Chef was that it extended the overall lifespan of the company as its core business was being disrupted by next generation technology, i.e. containers and Docker and that sort of thing. Now the negative, some of the challenges were in the execution of the integration. Integration problems running up against personnel conflicts. Founders tend to be headstrong, have very strong opinions, and integrating into a startup where the CTO of that startup also has very strong opinions led to less product integration and on a slower schedule than I think I might have desired, or it just happened too slowly, or in some cases it didn't happen at all. The other element of this is that geography was a problem. So Volcanosec is a German company, or was a German company. Chef was an American company. We had time zones. I was living in New York at the time. That was an 8 or 9 hour time difference. Getting synchronization, getting sync calls and meetings with the folks in Germany was challenging, and I think that contributed to some of the integration challenges and communication problems. So one of the lessons I learned here is that number one, not only do you need a strong integration plan from the business, but you also kind of need a directly responsible individual, DRI, for product management, to go and execute that product integration plan. In hindsight, I probably should have either myself gone to Germany for 3 months somewhere in there to work with them to integrate into the company, or somebody else should have had that lead role of doing that. The other lesson learned here, just as an individual PM, is talk to a lot of folks. Don't just talk to your customers. If you cast a broad net and you talk to a lot of people in your ecosystem, if you have one, you keep a lot of threads live. You never know what your next opportunity to conduct an alliance or an acquisition is going to come from. All right, let's move to a little bit of a bigger example. PagerDuty buying Rundeck in around 2020. This is substantially larger because the purchase price was near $100 million, which is somewhere in the neighborhood of 10x trailing revenues. The goodwill in this deal was about $72 million. So again, how did this one come about? Again, Rundeck was already a technology partner with PagerDuty. They were extending PagerDuty's incident response technology into automation, IT automation use cases, ticket deflection, that sort of a thing. So why was acquisition ultimately chosen? Well, Borrow was already working pretty well. And from a pure technology standpoint, we'd sort of hit the limits of what we could achieve in the product or creating a joint offering without deepening the integration to make a more cohesive solution. And one of the challenges here too was that PagerDuty was a SaaS only product and Rundeck was an on-premise product only. And in order to then deepen how PagerDuty handled and had connections to automation technology, we needed to wire it more into the internals of the SaaS. And that just wasn't going to be possible, or was going to be less effective to, let's say, create a whole bunch of APIs and things like that that were just for this particular partner. So just from a pure technology investment perspective and architecture perspective, it was kind of better to do it this way. The other thing is that we already knew that we wanted to move into automation because customers were asking us for it. So there were other options on the table that we were also looking at, other acquisitions, other partnerships, and things like that. This one was the most promising. There was more of a cultural fit. Rundeck had a bunch of DevOps thought leaders in the organization, and there was a cultural compatibility reason there too. So that's why this one was chosen and came about. So some of the overall outcomes of this one, again, positive was that the company moved very, very quickly on product integration and started, if you will, SaaSifying the acquired product very rapidly. And they did that by shifting product and engineering resources from the parent company, from PagerDuty, to Rundeck, to lead engineering teams there, to bring them into the fold quickly, to assess their technology stack, what parts of it we're going to need to change. Rundeck was written in a lot of Java. Again, as I said, it was an on-premise product. PagerDuty was SaaS and not written using Java, using Ruby and a bunch of other technologies. So it was important to harmonize that stuff and the practices and languages and technologies used to develop the unified stack as quickly as possible. Some of the challenges here is that while product and engineering integration, I thought, went pretty quickly and pretty smoothly, is that in some of the other functions, the integration did not happen as quickly as it should have. So sales and marketing was not integrated as quickly as possible. Marketing was not integrated as quickly as possible. So this caused a lot of brand confusion. It caused a lot of conflicts within different teams. It caused differing compensation models and sales plans and things like that. So it caused a lot of issues in the GTM side. So I kind of wish that had progressed at the same clip that the product and engineering integration went. So again, some of the lessons that I learned here was, when we went into the acquisition before it closed, it was not a bad integration plan that was developed, but once deals close, corporate development folks often are on to the next thing that they're working on. They've closed the deal, so it's somebody else's ball to receive, and so again, not having a DRI for the execution of that integration plan and having clear project management and milestones and things like that was kind of what it meant was every function was sort of left to its own devices. So again, really important to follow through on the execution plans you developed in these processes, and then. That was also influenced by, or the where we fell down in some of the integration activities was also just sort of a lack of a clear philosophy around whether or not the acquired company should be kept as its own brand, an organization, versus integrating it into the parent company. Pros and cons, of course. You have the requisite power struggles and friction and things like that between headstrong founders and parent company that that wants to drive things maybe more centrally and things like that. So. Again, a champion and a single DRI to kind of sort through those things from an integration plan execution perspective, I think is key to resolving these issues. All right, so just to wrap up, a couple of key conclusions. Number one is, can't reiterate strongly enough, having a strong product strategy is a crucial instrument to facilitate discussions about alliances and acquisitions with a leadership team. Otherwise, you're going to risk falling into this trap of random or opportunistic shopping, which is that leadership team or the CFO is buying quote unquote growth, but without really understanding why. The second point is that, and something that you should be aware of if you're a PM, is that companies often fall into the default mode of building things because it's often what they know best. So you really should think about yourself as that business owner that's trying to satisfy resource requirements rather than what can I build next, because build is not always the best option for you. So to that end, every PM should have alliances and acquisitions as a tool in their tool belt, and they should know how to both initiate conversations when they think that build is not the best option, and also be able to respond to such discussions from a corporate development team, or from a CFO, or from a CEO, or whatever it is. So don't abdicate this responsibility to corp dev or biz dev, because they might buy something that you don't want and force you to integrate it in the worst case. And just a few resources to leave you with. Number one is the book I mentioned about strategy, Lafley and Martin, Playing to Win, How Strategy Really Works. Fantastic book, very easy to read. And number two is Capron and Mitchell, Build, Borrow, Buy. That's sort of my go-to book. They also have a HBR article that's 2 or 3 pages long that kind of summarizes their philosophy around this. And you can sort of start with that and then progress to the book. Again, the book is very short. Both of these books are very short, very accessible, and very readable.